Hello, everybody, and welcome to our World Today, the Unionist perspective. Today, we're looking at a couple of topics that we believe are quite important in not only the view of what's happening in the world today, but also in the run-up to what are going to be two major elections. So one happening in the US in 2024, one happening in South Africa in 2024. And both countries having gone through a state of, well, in South Africa, it's called the State of a Nation Address. And in the US, it's called the State of the Union Address. So very much aligned in that sense, but very different messages coming through in what has been happening in both countries. And then also, what's interesting is another almost parallel to both of these is how the Republican Party in the US has been heckling Biden during his State of the Union address. And quite similar things have happened in South Africa with one of our smaller political parties heckling President Ramaphosa to the point where they were removed from the State of the Nation address. So, there's a lot of parallel in terms of people wanting leadership to show up more and stand up more, but also in the way that they're doing it and in the messages that are coming through. And for me, the thing that stands out quite top of mind is obviously the declaration of a national state of disaster in South Africa related to the electricity crisis. And so, that stands out for me most of all. I want to just check in with the team. What, in terms of our topics, have stood out for you, and which would you like to explore first?
I'm fine with starting with the South Africa one. I think that one stands out at the top for me. So yeah, we can start there. I'm okay with that.
Okay, cool. So I think something that when I read that article, I was like, it almost feels a little bit contrived because I live in this country and I've kind of been experiencing what is being shared in the article, but I feel like it's a little bit contrived in that it doesn't quite paint the real picture. So yes, it highlights that there are significant issues just from the point of view of supermarkets having challenges around electricity, which means they have challenges around keeping food fresh, which means they have challenges around selling their goods and employing people. And one of the things that was in the article that I was like, that kind of concerned me a little bit was the sense that our quoted unemployment is 1 in 3 people. And I kind of have to almost say, no, I believe that number is higher. I mean, obviously, we can't go 1.5 in 3 people, but I feel like it's a higher number. I also feel like the electricity crisis is not quite shared in real terms. So yes, there's the little supermarket, but there's also the bigger concern around what it's doing to the economy and the ability to create jobs in our economy, to the ability to actually stimulate the economy in the first place, because you don't attract investment where people cannot be productively employed by those companies that are bringing investment into South Africa. So there's a lot around the ANC's leadership and Cyril Ramaphosa's presidency that feels a little bit almost underplayed. And I feel like the person that wrote the article, while they did a great job of finding some facts, has not really put the facts in a perspective that makes the rest of our country or the world realize the dire underlying consequences, because it's not just about the small supermarket. It's literally a much more intrusive way of kind of shifting people's life. And I think one of the things that's probably not coming through in the article is just the level of anxiety that people feel, because I don't know if you guys recall, I kind of mentioned the whole scheduled power outages, which means that there's a lot of panic in the system, because you kind of have to get things done within certain parameters of time, because otherwise you're sitting with, and the thing is, you're sitting with pockets of your day without electricity, and you're sitting with a schedule that schedules the outages, but also schedules the length of time of the outages in terms of stages. So there might be a 2-hour stint 2 or 3 times a day, but there could also be a 4-hour stint 2 or 3 times a day. So I feel like the significance of the challenge is downplayed, and probably because you also don't want to report in that way, given that it feels to me like it was almost a cursory exploration or research of the topic. And then also the area in which the area that the person's quoting is probably a smaller section of South Africa. And there are much bigger formal and informal living settings that are affected by this crisis. But what it does is it also creates a lot of opportunity for crime, which is another consequence affecting more people, because as we know, opportunistic criminals will strike where they believe they are going to get away with it. And one of the things that is happening is that they steal power cables, which are made of copper, to sell. So that exacerbates the problem, because even when the outage is turned on, when the power is turned back on in certain areas, it's not actually turned on, because now there's a significant requirement to replace those copper cables to conduct the electricity as well. And I mean, there's just like part of it is, and something that you guys probably may or may not know, is that our power generator, Eskom, actually won world awards for its ability to generate electricity, probably about 20 years ago. So for that significant shift to have happened in the last 20 to 25 years just shows the significant mismanagement of a state-owned enterprise. So there's a lot more in terms of background, in terms of history, but also in terms of consequence that doesn't come through in that article. And that's why I'm kind of just sharing the fuller picture from the perspective of somebody that's actually living through it, as opposed to reporting on it.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because that was kind of my feeling too. I felt like, and I don't have much familiarity with South Africa other than knowing a few people here and there. So for me, as someone that's like totally ignorant about what's actually happening on the ground, I could still feel like it was such a vague article, and I kept asking myself, well, there must be more. Like, I was just expecting it to like go in depth, and it just felt like a very like surface level and very narrow depiction of the problem. And I know that you, Granville, personally are living it. Like, that's your current reality, like dealing with all that. So that was mainly why I wanted to share, just to kind of get your take on it, because we've talked about South Africa before, and the alleged corruption of the president, and people wanting a change in the leadership. And I just felt like there wasn't a good dive into kind of like what you were saying, the like behind the scenes, like what actually has happened in South Africa, what choices have been made to lead the country to this place now where people are basically suffering because of these power outages. And crime is also like the main social indicator of, in my opinion, of like the health of a society. And anytime there's like opportunistic crime, instrumental crime, where people are doing things to make money, to get food on the table, or whatever it is, it's usually a sign that something is amiss from the bigger leadership. So I'm interested to talk further about like the specific choices that have been made over the decades, because those were kind of the comments too in the article. A few people that were actually living in South Africa said the same thing that you were saying, that it's just a very narrow view, and like it didn't do the problem justice the way that it was written. And people mentioned, I guess some people outside of South Africa brought up like apartheid and all the things that happened there during that time. And so I'm interested in how that plays into what's happening now.
Yeah, so I think one of the, and it's a good thing that you bring it up, because a lot of the narrative has been around picking up the pieces from apartheid and what the challenges have been, and blaming the apartheid government for certain things, as opposed to blaming a lack of service delivery. And so one of the challenges is that we have been a democracy since 1990. We have had the ANC in power since 1994, initially led by Nelson Mandela, and then progressively over years changed across to certain people. And so one of the things that's probably good to mention from a historical point of view is that the president's corruption is not specific to the current president. It's specific to his predecessor. However, there's also been with the current president that there was an investigation of him because US dollars were stolen from his farm and he failed to report the crime. And so that investigation is happening. So it might smack of corruption, but it also smacks of not knowing what is happening in his presidency. What's also a concern in his presidency not delivering is that he is probably one of the more respected businessmen in South Africa prior to really showing up more fully in politics. So there's almost almost qualification process in unpacking the little components that make you like literally sharpen the lens. It's literally like when you're looking at something through a microscope. That lens kind of needs to be calibrated to really see what's happening with those organisms. And so this cursory exploration of a crisis in terms of the article doesn't quite do the microscopic lens that is required to look at the problem through any justice. And so a lot of it comes from blaming what happened in the past. But, for me, like when I speak to people and they kind of carry on about this thing about cleaning up apartheid and everything, the concern for me is if you live in a house and the window is broken, and the window has been broken while you've lived in that house, but it didn't break, you moved into a whole house. And inadvertently, through whatever, the window broke. Now you blame the previous tenant for not fixing the window. It's the level of the ridiculous in it has to come through, and we kind of have to pay attention and go, well, no, guys. In 25 years, you have put the country back 50 years through mismanagement and corruption, maybe even 70 to 100 years through mismanagement and corruption. We can't continue to blame a previous regime. We can't continue to blame a previous system of government. So there's kind of this balancing act of, yes, there were significant challenges in the transition. But does the transition really take 20 to 25 years? And if it does, what does that say about the capability of the people that are meant to be leading the transition? So yeah, I'm very opinionated about it from a different perspective, because I do believe that even in all this, there's hope. But the hope stems from people needing to pull together as opposed to accepting the divide and conquer philosophy that we have based with these very many little political parties that sometimes just cannot even sit around the same table to have a conversation, never mind address the problem and put solutions on the table.
Yeah, I feel like there hasn't been a resolution to the core of the problem. And it reminds me of, he gave management or administration to someone else for the energy company, and the guy quit within a week. I think he said that he was gonna get poisoned or something. And now knowing from you that he had a business background, why did he appoint someone not really, filtering through the qualifications of who can handle this mess that's going on? And I'm seeing a lack of management, even from someone who has a background in this business management. So I'm really wondering why, and also why he's starting new projects when these core projects really need to be dived into. Is it a distraction for him to show a ploy for the election? Like, hey, these are all the things that we're doing. Or is it just that he cannot handle this energy crisis and he doesn't know what to do about it, and he doesn't know who to appoint for it? So, and it kind of reminds me of the Biden administration, because he's also starting these new projects, saying these new things, but really the core of the issues throughout his administration has not really been touched on or really dived deep in transformation. So, yeah.
See, and that's another thing. So the person that they quote as having left after a week didn't leave after a week. He was the CEO of the power utility for a while. And when he really started standing up and saying, well, actually, do not blame years of underperformance on my team that are trying to do something, that's when he started to feel under threat, to the extent that there was a supposed attempt on his life. We don't necessarily have the details, but it's literally taking the board and now making them accountable for years of mismanagement and saying that this problem happened under your watch, and not giving them the opportunity to really get into the space where they can actually do something about it. And then you have a power utility that's underperforming, but asking for a rate hike from the national energy regulator. So it's like compelling people to pay more for something that they're not receiving in the first place. And this is why this national state of disaster has now been declared. Because literally, there is no more room in the suitcase for more crap. At some point, that suitcase is full. You cannot fill it. You cannot close it any further. And you're not going to get let on the plane unless you pay extra for the extra luggage. And I think the economics of what's happening here, not only from an economics point of view, but the social economics, the mental economics are all taking a significant strain on the South African population. And this supposedly good businessman hasn't quite demonstrated his ability to manage, to put solid leaders into positions in state-owned enterprises, but he's also not necessarily proven his ability to manage a country from a presidential point of view. And I think that's the thing that we mustn't lose sight of. So all these new fancy things, power plants being commissioned that take years to complete, that are underperforming, that don't perform, or are in a state of collapse because, well, they were just poorly managed from the very beginning, kind of says to you, it's deflection from the core of the problem. And the core of the problem is that a new choice needs to be made to live a healthy, stable life. And it's starting to come through from South Africans and other political parties that vote for, that the South African population are voting for. And so that's why we now have this scramble to declare a national state of disaster related to the electricity crisis. But having done that, we put the person that's supposedly going to be managing the national state of disaster is the same person that managed the national state of disaster during COVID. And that was also mismanaged. So it's like there is the strong feeling is living a choice to live a healthy and stable life, but also a choice to accept leadership responsibility and to lead well. And I feel like that's the core of our challenge in South Africa, is that the leaders that we need are not showing up in the places where we need them.
Do you think it's like a systematic corruption that's going on with the leaders? Like, I feel like the leaders might be starting off as like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I have a plan in mind. But once they're appointed, they see the cushion and the comfort of how things were going, and they see like they can benefit from the old ways of doing things. So then changing things just becomes way too much for them. That like, oh, someone else will handle it after my regime, but let me get the benefits that I can from right now. What do you think about
I
that?
think it's kind of twofold. And I think you've touched on the one component in terms of getting the power and clinging to the power, but also there's another dynamic at play in that within his own party, his top leadership in his party don't all completely support him. So there are factions in this leading party that probably are also are actually poisoning the well, creating the conditions for failure. And for as long as he wants to maintain a power base, he has not been and probably can't be too tough on him if he wants to cling to his power. And it's something that we had a conversation of around certain other presidents in other countries that make lofty promises to get elected, but once they are elected, they don't generally deliver. And that's why, again, it feels to me like the core of the issue is a lack of leadership, or even just not fully accepting and respecting your position of leadership. So yeah, it's like there's lots of dynamics that we could probably talk about in how this is playing out, but I did want to very, very clearly highlight that the article glossed over the extent of the challenge. And it feels like it was not very well researched, but it might have been also that it was very well researched, but the message was watered down for a specific audience.
And I had one more question about the rotating of electricity throughout South Africa. I feel like this could be a temporary solution, as well as I saw from the article, people are selling solar panels. If they could have like an organization when it comes to when they're getting electricity and when they can absorb it for the night, I feel like that could have been a little bit of an ease for the country as they're trying to transition. But even then, it's not showing as a solution from what I read in the article. What did you think about that?
So I work for a company that does asset finance. And quite a few of our suppliers are exploring rental systems for solar panels and that kind of stuff. Our challenge is that renewable energy in South Africa as a segment of the economy is not regulated. So it's not regulated to the extent that it needs to be regulated. So you will have the shark that will get clients but charge them ridiculous prices. You will get the person that does a shoddy installation, so people's houses burn down. So there's, the appointing a minister of electricity is quite for me, and it's almost ill-conceived and a little bit short-sighted in the sense that it probably is a renewable energy portfolio. And in that renewable energy portfolio, there has to be much more regulation so that the person that's the consumer is protected to an extent, but that the market is regulated so that prices don't vary based on somebody's desire to make money. Because also, I have solar panels. I did it because I couldn't function without it. They are not like there's a significant component of our society that cannot afford to do that kind of thing, because they live either on the breadline or below the breadline. So there's rampant poverty in big components of our society that just doesn't allow them to probably have the resources to do what some others can. But doing that also then means that we pay for electricity from the grid, or we pay for a significant installation to remove ourselves off the grid. If you do the significant installation to remove yourself off the grid, you can sell excess electricity back into the grid. A couple of years ago, it was a big controversy and you weren't allowed to. Then there was a big controversy because you were then required to sell it into the grid at a lower price than what you were buying from the grid. So like the economics of the situation just doesn't make sense. Why would I do that? Why would I use the grid at a higher price and sell my electricity back into the grid at a lower price? You know, so those kind of caveats that happen in the background that just make you think like, is somebody actually using their two brain cells? You know, and then you know, you sometimes have to go to that extent of like, what is really happening here? Is there actually a logical thought process behind a lot of this stuff? And you know, it's literally a situation of trying not to buy into the direness of the situation while still understanding that the reality is not doesn't reflect a healthy dynamic, and it doesn't like it serves it literally serves very few people, because in order to do installations, it's an expensive thing. There are now companies that are starting to do rental installations. So it's their structure, it's their product. You just pay a monthly rental fee. If something doesn't work, hey, come and take your crap out, put something new in, and Bob's your uncle, we carry on. The business that I support as HR is actually supporting those new vendors that are going into the rental of solar equipment to smaller houses, because there's a definite need for it. So you know, there's a lot of desire for entrepreneurs to actually support movements in sustainable energy and things like that. But again, you know, it comes back to the state and regulating that industry and ensuring that solid products are being used. So subpar installations create all sorts of other challenges. But in an unregulated industry, who takes who to task about what and when? So yeah, that's my mouthful. But yeah, I think it was important for us to just also delve into the nuts and bolts of some of this.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I feel like there's a lot of parallels though with like Biden's State of the Union and what's going on in the US. So if you guys are okay, maybe we can pivot to that and just talk about the choices there. Because I feel like there's a similar feeling of just not being unified in leadership. I think like across the board, that is the same in South Africa and the US. It just feels a little different in the US because it's always like the Democrats and the Republicans just like going at it. And you know, and his State of the Union address was apparently like very, very much like that, like unruly Republicans in the audience, just, you know, shouting out things or just, saying things. And, Biden trying very hard to demonstrate that he's an effective leader. And obviously he has hopes to be reelected. That's usually how it goes. But I think Sarah Huckabee, that's her name, who was Speaker of the House under Trump. She made like some sort of like announcement after the union, just kind of calling Biden out, but it just seemed like calling out like the old guard, like that we kind of need newer leadership, like basically people that haven't been in politics for decades upon decades, or were businessmen and then became politicians like Donald Trump. And so I wanted to get a feel for what you guys were feeling with that and the parallels.
I was curious to follow up with what Nadia said earlier, because she was saying how, like, how we were talking about how in both South Africa and the US, there were cases of like the top leadership starting a project and then not really delving into it, and then starting other ones. Or what were you referring to with the US? I was curious because, yeah.
I just feel like the employment and the economy projects that he had promised just never came into fruition. And that was pretty much what I was looking into, the economy and the changes that he promised. He never really went to the core of it. And I saw that a lot of the US population are now, even though unemployment increased because of people leaving their jobs, I'm sorry, I think unemployment decreased, but there was a lot of people that were leaving their jobs because they were unsatisfied. And I think there's like a united force coming of like the standard of workforce in America, and how it's just not up to par and not really looked into deeply of why isn't there more of a quality life work balance, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I think were you talking about like the Green New Deal type of stuff that he wanted to do, like with the Inflation Reduction Act, and like adding all those new jobs of like energy and stuff like that? Yeah. I know I haven't really heard much talk about that, even though that was passed and everything. But I feel like
that and the oil projects that he's saying he's going to renew right now. And even both sides, the Democratic and Republican, were like, what are you talking about? This is a time for us to look at newer energy resources. But he's trying to keep us in this past present of like trying to reinvest in fossil fuel. And it's just crazy.
Yeah, I wanted to mention one little thing too I found interesting, is that just kind of related to this thing in the US about like, should we fossil fuel or should we not fossil fuel? And it's that in Colorado, because I heard this on the local news, there's a pipeline that's supposed to go through this big county in the state. And it's apparently it's still a Republican controlled county. And usually like overall the Republican Party is supported fossil fuels, but they are objecting to it, the leadership in that county, because they're like, we don't want it going through the county because it's too much of an environmental hazard, because of the oil spills, that happen. And I know there was a big oil spill too recently. There was a huge one in Kansas recently. And I feel like people are starting to become more aware of that, like their constituents probably are, where they're like, even a Republican controlled county would be like, no, we don't want this. And I thought that was really interesting, but that was a bit of an aside. But it is interesting how he's trying to like do what he feels is most appealing to the biggest number of people. That seems interesting. And I felt that there was a lack of a real clarity around, do we really want a progressive agenda or not? And I feel like that's the Democratic Party's big issue. Whereas that makes it less galvanizing for people. Whereas like with the Republican Party, there felt to be more galvanization around the issues that the more extreme people in the party are putting forward. Like there's more energy around it. And I was like, that's interesting. I feel like they need to just get clear on like what their priorities are. Is that what you were feeling?
Yeah, I feel like that has been for decades now, where there's so much more strength in the Republican Party of unity, whereas in the Democratic Party, it's like kind of more spewed out. And even if there's opinions that are more spewed out, there could be more strength in like where we want our aim to be. But there isn't such a stronghold of goals and aims compared to the Republican Party. And I know there were so many bills that couldn't get passed through the Democratic Party because there wasn't a unified like strength like the Republican Party has. So
yeah, I agree. I feel like there's just in terms of like the issues that the leadership or people that potentially want to go into that focus on, it seems to just kind of target like the greatest amount of people that they can to get the votes, but it doesn't really like get to the core problems in the US that, you know, we've been spending decades upon decades trying to address. And like, you know, one specifically, like crime is always one platform that politicians use, like, oh, we got to get tough on crime, we have to do this. And but and like unfortunately I feel like most Americans are just ignorant to like the causes of crime and what really drives people choosing that behavior. You know, it's not that they're bad people and we have to get tough on crime. It stems from like family issues, it stems from the economy, it stems from just like feeling, you know, socially isolated. And we have all these like smaller, I mean, to me, they're big problems, but I feel like there's always like a small attention, because the article that I think Sage posted about the State of the Union, they kind of broke down like in bubbles, you know, how much time Biden spent talking about these topics, and like family stuff. I think like most of it was just around the economy and jobs. But how can you expect people to like really be in the workforce, like really be good workers or employees, if, you know, the family institution is kind of broken, or like our other institutions, like, you know, the mental health system in this country is very much broken as well. I mean, prisons have become like the de facto entity that deals with people who have mental health issues, and that just should not be the case, because it's just like a revolving door. Just people are in and out of prison and they never get the attention that they need. And so that's kind of like where I understand what people are talking about in terms of like we need fresher ideas, just like newer energy. Because I feel like for so long the American economy, I mean the American society, like politically, is just focused on the economy, but the economy cannot be healthy if families aren't healthy, if individuals aren't healthy, if like, I mean, the fact that not all children have access to the same quality of education, you know, like from just depending on the sort of socioeconomic area that you're born into, you're like you're either going to have a easier time getting an education or you're going to have a harder time. And that and I feel like that all bleeds into like the economy, and like what you were saying, Nadia, with having like a good workforce. I mean, there's so much pressure for people to go to college, but as someone who is a professor, like I don't think a lot of those people need to be there. And I don't say that in a mean way, but like, why not go learn a trade? That is also respectful. Like those things are hard, you know? And there's nothing wrong with like learning a trade and working with your hands and not going to like higher education. But I feel like the messaging and the packaging is so like uninformed and just like not presented accurately that unless you're like me, who's just like has a degree in criminology and like sociology and just has studied these things, or you have an interest, like you'll never really understand like the thing that you're embedded within, if that makes sense, like the machine that is you know the any given society.
Yeah, so when it comes to like, so it seems like what we're getting from this is that the message was very broad. It was mainly focused on this. He said the State of the Union is good, and so, and focused on like we're having a lot of new jobs added to the economy and all of that. And then some people on the other hand are saying like, no, we don't want that. We don't want the economy to keep growing too fast because there could be like a bubble and then it'll pop and we'll have a recession, which that's its own conversation. But what do you feel like is the truth behind all of this? Because it seems like he's pretty much trying to paint broadly a picture of like the economy's good, more jobs, and that's pretty much it. What do you feel is the truth underlying all of this? You know?
So my sense across both of these is when you paint with broad strokes, what is clear when you paint with broad strokes?
Nothing.
You kind of have to sift. In fact, you don't have to sift because the brush stroke is so broad that it covers up so much.
Yeah.
And my challenge is that in both of these countries, there's a lot of glossing over of the real issues. The real issues, and you shared with us a view as well in terms of also power cuts in the French Caribbean. And the core of it is a choice of poverty. And literally the real issues are poverty. The real issues are powerlessness. And what happens when you push a beast into a corner? And I'm using the terminology not in calling people beasts, but in the analogy. When you push a beast into a corner, what happens? It lashes out. It has to lash out. We are geared to try and protect ourselves in one way or another. Some of us are geared to be very competitive and very opportunistic. Some of us are geared to be a lot more persistent about what we want and what we need and going after it and standing up and having the courage of our convictions. But all of that stuff is deflected from because we're still in a cycle of recovery. We're in a cycle of recovery from the last 3 years of sheer crap. We are in a cycle of recovery from the last 3 years of isolation and trying to catch up and trying to feel human. And then we have people almost eroding our humanity through a lack of leadership, through an inability to coordinate their departments, inability to deliver on what we've employed them for. Because the fact of the matter is, all governments are actually the employee of the people. Mm-hmm. It is not a monarchy. They are not all powerful. They are employed by the voter, by the taxpayer. So there's a lot related to humanity's choice to still have this dance with poverty, humanity's choice to still have this dance with powerlessness, humanity's choice to still have this dance with narcissism, because we are finding leaders that are narcissistic in their desire for power. They may say the right things, they may even appear to do the right things, but are they actually doing it? And the reason why I said is, it's as simple as, if you want to know somebody's mind, listen to their words. If you want to know somebody's heart, look at their actions.
Yeah, that brought a good point for me, is like people are looking at the government as their source, and the government is not your source. And I'm actually, as much as it's like, wow, Biden really didn't do much in his regime, I think there was a need for Biden for a transition, because we had Trump and people were like, oh my God. And then like we kind of got a little bit of a transition period where we can see what the issues are and what they're brewing into. And what Sage was saying, it could lead to economic bubble bursting. I mean, from my experience in the housing industry, seeing how the percentage of mortgage rates are increasing, decreasing, it's just like very confusing for people. There's an instability that we're not sure what's going to be the next error for the economy, and if it will be beneficial for them to, really stand on their own or not. So, but it does push us, like you said, putting that beast into that corner, it does push us to really look at what do we want, and not look at the government as source, but as our own individual person, even building our own business. Like, how can we stand on our own, regardless of what the government's going on and what's happening? Yeah. So I think it's a good period for us to really look at ourselves, because Biden definitely needs to look at himself and say, what are you actually doing? But it was much needed. We didn't need a very drastic leadership right after Trump, because that was already traumatic in itself. So
yeah, I agree. And I think most people don't see it in that terms, but in that terms. But that's something that Jeff and Shaleia pointed out about Biden's election, and I agree with it. And I think you can't always expect to have like dramatic short-term results necessarily. I liked what Yoreen was saying in the comments here about our politicians might not know how to partner with people and how to educate them. That is a really good point, because if politicians are not interested in, if you're not interested in really talking to the people whom you're leading and really getting clear with them, like, these are the actual issues, this is what's happening, let me tell you, but you're just pointing to things that are very, very broadly known, like you're going for like the least common denominator of knowledge in society, you're never going to get anywhere, because you're just going to be going based on these knee-jerk reactions that people have to certain like little numbers and developments and surface level stuff in your country.
Yeah.
So that's true. And I think that maybe there's a feeling of like, that's a lot of risk or whatever to make the conversation more like it, to respect people's need for that more. Yeah. I feel like they need to, though.
Yeah.
And I also agree with what you guys were saying and what Yoreen was saying with people not doing their purpose and not learning to create wealth for themselves, because it's kind of like, if you're doing something, if the society is composed of a bunch of people and organizations that are taking from themselves or like taking from others in order to get this temporary gain, eventually there's going to be this this negative fallout that's caused by all that taking. And so it's just a cyclical thing, and it's not really anything, it's not like a new story at all.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I agree. I feel like what we're all saying, like the core of it is like this choosing of powerlessness, but it's almost like the leadership perpetuates that because it benefits them if, you know, everyone thinks that like, oh, this is just how it is, and, you know, I'm destined to live this life of poverty, and this is just me. I'm just gonna go commit crimes and, you know, whatever. But like, and that's where I was getting at with like the focusing on families and education. Like it's more, it goes deeper than, you know, just surface level, but like really empowering people, and like instead of building systems around poverty that don't, like a welfare system that doesn't really address the issue, or child protective services that really doesn't address the issue of you know, family violence or, you know, maltreatment, it just perpetuates it, because once again it's like an outside entity coming in telling people what to do instead of flipping it and, you know, making all of us realize that we've created this society, that we're all deciding to choose this, and, you know, the social response is just an extension of that. And I feel like America, I don't know, maybe because you know, I live here, I'm most familiar with it, but I feel like America is like the perfect example of just like a situation like that, because it's, you know, it's all about the economy, and the economy is great, but when you really look deep, you know, it's like maggots and it's like decay, and just like there's so many social problems that we have, but yet, you know, we're the, you know, wealthiest nation in the world, as, you know, some politicians like to say. And it's like, wealth based on what? It's just you know, wealth based on illusion. It's not true wealth. It can like disappear like that in a flash.
But Andia, who really knows how to raise a family divinely? Like who's teaching, you know? And
Yeah.
I even feel like we've lost touch with our roots in tradition with motherhood and raising a family. I remember a study showing how in Africa, mothers will let like less than 1 year olds a little loose so that they can move their neck and gain more stability in their neck on their own. And here it's like, oh, no, you have to coddle the baby, you have to wrap them around, you have to keep them there, you know, and that's fundamental to developing strength in your bones that we, as the most educated, as the most like researched country, don't even know that we're not like these traditional knowings that we just completely like threw out, or don't even know how essential they are, you know? So who can really teach us aside from like what we're learning right now and from our Church of Union, from this, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, you're right. That's the problem. Jeff and Shaleia for president.
Yeah. No.
You know what the thing is, something that you all are alluding to is education. It's about educating people. But you you know, literally our last point, because we are on our hour, so if we want to continue the conversation, we will do so next week. But
Bye.
yeah. So, you know, the way to set people free is through education. But if you look at how education is actually failing people, you have to just realize that there is no real intent to set people free. So it's upon us to choose our freedom by choosing to learn, by choosing to educate ourselves so that we are informed under as many circumstances as we possibly can. As Unionists, we very fully understand that there is significant power in our choice, and we need to honor that power. And it's upon us then to teach the world how to honor that power. But not going out there with the big stick. It's literally, as we know, starting on the inside. So yeah, thank you everybody for today's conversation. Thank you to Yoreen for joining us from the bleachers, as she calls it.
Yeah.
To everybody that's liked our conversation today, please also feel free to like and subscribe to our Church of Union YouTube channel. And we all look forward to seeing you next week for a continuation of this conversation or other topics that we believe are relevant and important to explore from the Unionist perspective. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.